first game that we are going to be diving into from last night is the Dallas Mavericks and LA Clippers, where it looked like we were going to have a competitive game on our hands. We'll get into the Celtics Heat a little bit later in the show, but that was the first game of the night, and that was very uncompetitive, so it was a little refreshing seeing the back and forth going on between the Mavericks and the Clippers through the first half, but ultimately the Mavericks just ended up demolishing the Clippers in that second half. They end up winning by 30 points, 123-93. The Mavericks lead was 10 at halftime, and the Clippers were in it, but it did seem like in that second quarter, the Mavericks were really building on something defensively, and they were locked in, and that ended up being the case where they were just able to pull away. They held both Paul George and James Harden to very ineffective nights, thanks to the likes of PJ Washington and Derrick Jones Jr., who were both tremendous in this game in my eyes. I actually didn't even realize that PJ Washington was 1 of 7 from the field offensively until this morning when I went back and looked at the box score, because of the fact that it felt like he was still making an impact. So obviously in the long term, they are going to want him to provide some more offense, but he played his role last night and he did exactly what they needed him to do. You saw he was picking up some of these ball handlers for LA all the way the length of the court. And again, eventually they're going to want more offense from him. I still think he's had a good series as a whole, but last night still finding a way to be impactful without scoring. And that was really the story for all of their key players, including Kyrie Irving, who had a down night in terms of his averages, scored 14 points, but he was also really impactful, diving on the ground for loose balls, and he was helping to run the court, set up his teammates, all of the above. So I thought that the Mavericks really had a convincing performance last night, and it was built off of the defense that they played, and they have been a very solid defensive team. There was that stretch right directly following the All-Star break where they definitely were struggling at that point, but since then they have been one of the best defensive units in the league. They are top 5 in terms of defensive rating post All-Star break. Big boss Andrew Tate at the company, he gave a stat in a production meeting earlier today that they are the number 1 defensive team since the beginning of March, I believe. So you're going to have to take his word for that. I haven't had time to double check that, but the eye test would back that up because they have been really incredible on that side of the ball. And this is what is sort of taking them from the fun team that they were to a legitimate, dark horse finals contender. And I've been on the Mavericks really since they made their moves at the trade deadline. I know that it was a little polarizing. They did give up a lot in order to go get PJ Washington, specifically that pick. I believe it's in 2029, that if this were to fully fall by the wayside, that could end up being a very valuable pick. But as things currently stand, we've talked about it before on the show, it seems like Luka Doncic is having as much fun as he ever has in his career playing alongside Kyrie Irving, and we're going to sort of dive into that dynamic a little more down the stretch of the show, but I want to sort of fixate here on the defense and the job that these role players played in the Mavericks being able to pull away with this. Like I mentioned, Derrick Jones Jr., PJ Washington, those were the main 2 that were guarding the likes of James Harden and Paul George for the Clippers, and they just did a terrific job. George and Harden both dropped 33 points in their Game 4 victory on Wednesday night. They combined for just 22 points. George was 4 of 13 from the field. Harden was 2 of 12. It was a bad game for them. And yes, I understand reputations are definitely a part of the conversation for them, but I don't think you can chalk it up just to, eventually they're going to, choke in the playoffs. Something has to occur in order for that to happen, and I thought it was the defensive efforts by the Mavericks players in order to make that happen. And It's funny when looking at the Mavericks because they still might not have the perfect option from that small forward, that 3 spot, but I do think that Jason Kidd, for as much as it felt like he was on the hot seat for a little bit there during the regular season and he's had some people upset with him, I think that he's done a really good job down the stretch of this year to sort of toy with their different options. And keep in mind, they're without Tim Hardaway Jr. right now, who wasn't really playing as much towards the end of the season anyways, but he ended up spraining his ankle earlier in the playoffs this series. But finding a way to get production out of that 3 spot, Derrick Jones Jr., who I just praised his defense, he actually scored 12 points as well on the offensive side of the ball to help contribute for them. Josh Green, I was sort of upset with Kidd myself early in the series when they weren't playing him as much, but it seems like he's sort of earning his minutes a little bit more. Again, I feel like the 3-and-D ability from him, the intensity that he brings, sort of the young legs that he can provide to help run the court, help play defense, and lock in on a consistent basis, even though the offensive consistency isn't always there. And the resurgence of Dante Exum, who hasn't been a massive factor in this series, but I still feel like on, any given moment, offensively, he can sort of showcase some real stuff for them and be a little bit of a creator is maybe a lot, but I do think that he can sort of initiate some offense in limited sequences. And, he's been a really fun story after being out of the NBA from being a lottery pick in the mid-2010s and really bouncing around. But now here he is, finally healthy and, playing a role in this team. And that same sort of versatility at the 3 spot, I feel like they have with the big man position as well, where Gafford has been the regular starter for them since they traded for him at the All-Star break. But they definitely play around with the minutes of that rotation of big men that they have with Gafford, Maxi Kleber, and Derek Lively. And I found it really interesting that they were running a lot of those double big lineups last night. The key to it really was the fact that Kleber has been a massive impact player for them. It looked like he was unplayable in game 1, but since then he has done a really important job for them. He's closed some of these closer games, and it's because of the fact that he's been shooting really well. He provides that spacing. He is 9 of 12 from 3 since that pretty dreadful game 1 performance. He has been able to, like I said, spread the floor for them. He hasn't been taken advantage of defensively, and they use him sort of as the 4, a bigger 4, granted, maybe a little bit more old school, but still with the modern day spacing that makes it worth, because we know that Lively and Gafford don't necessarily have the outside shot, but they're both rim runners and can potentially get stuff on the inside for them. So it's sort of perplexing for opposing defenses. And, if you look at Cleaning the Glass, which is a website that has a lot of really helpful stats, if you look at their lineups during the postseason so far, their most successful lineups have been with Luka, Kyrie, Derrick Jones Jr., Maxi Kleber, and either Gafford or Lively in terms of lineups that have gotten at least 10 possessions. The net rating has been the highest with those double big lineups, which is really interesting to see. A lot of those minutes coming off of last night's game as well, where obviously the Mavericks ran away with it. So the sample size is still pretty small, but they may have discovered something there. And I feel like part of the reason why this is working so well is because you look at the other side with the Clippers, and I'm going to have to sort of look more into this, especially as the series progresses on, and what the Mavericks are going to do long term if they do advance out of the first round, is the fact that they can get away with not having their bigs necessarily being exposed along the perimeter as much, because of the fact that at least last night it seemed like a lot of those minutes were coming with Russell Westbrook on the floor for the Clippers, where you have to love and appreciate Westbrook for the career that he's had, and he was excellent in game 1. If you remember back to the playoffs last year when they were playing the Suns, some of the effort levels he was giving, especially defensively, he was a big-time impact player. but at the same time, when he's not the initiator, it's really tough for him offensively because of the fact that he just can't shoot. And because of that, Kleba is able to sort of play off of him, sit back in the paint, instead of necessarily having a situation where him and whatever other big they have out there, be it Gafford or Lively, they're not being consistently put into guarding these perimeter players, and it just doesn't really seem like... I would definitely wouldn't say that Westbrook is unplayable, but at the same time, he's 6 of 35 since game 1, from the field, that is, and it's just really tough for Westbrook. It's sort of hard to see, and you know that every single possession he's going to give is 100%, but it's just, again, it's tough when he's playing off ball offensively, because what does he really do? And that's still something that you can see him sort of adjusting to in these recent years. Now, I'm sort of curious what his answer would be to that type of question of how does he think that he can impact a game. And you know what? He gets, in some of these instances, I feel like we've seen a lot this year, when you sort of sag off of one of these big-time athletes. Zion is the one that really comes to mind for me, but when you play off of them so much, you let them ramp up and drive, and, you know, finishing at the rim just hasn't been there for Westbrook. Obviously, that is sort of the instance where it seems like he would be able to get his, and maybe it's more about cutting off ball on his other teammates' drives, but it just has not been pretty for him in this series. And like I was talking about, the other stepping up is something I really wanted to highlight for the Mavericks in this situation. But at the same time, this game resulted the way that it did because of Luka Doncic, and you know, everybody else that stepped up was just sort of icing on the cake, because I thought that Luka was great in this game, specifically on the offensive side. He talked about the fact that he felt like he was letting down Kyrie Irving. This was after Game 4 in the post-game press conference. He said that he needed to help Kyrie out more, and that is what he did last night, even though he went into it with that knee soreness. I believe it was his right knee. Heard a report that he was also feeling a little bit sick as well, but ends up dropping 35 points and 10 assists. And I thought that this was a really fun version of Luka Doncic, where instead of this slow-paced sort of they walk it up and Luka gets a pick and he sort of runs a two-man game and he has to dictate everything in the half court, and it just feels a little bit repetitive. Seemed like the Mavericks as a whole were looking to run with more pace in this game, going up and down the court, and Luka was still dictating a lot, but he was doing so in just a much more entertaining version, at least in my eyes, where it was putting, you know, all of his talents. We know that he can drive, we know he can pass, we know he can shoot, all of these things, even though last night wasn't even his best three-point shooting percentage performance, that is, but he was able to help get everybody involved, in doing so in a very intriguing way. Kyrie as well sort of added some of that energy as well, and this was just a much more natural use, I feel like, of some of these incredible skills that Luka has, that again can just be a little bit repetitive when it's this same sort of half-court look. It feels like he needs to dominate every single possession. That was at least less of the case last night, it felt like, and I had a lot of fun watching it. So, you know, it's going to be something interesting maybe to see going forward here, where this playoffs, I don't know about that necessarily, but you talk about the idea of what is the next level Luka can get to, because he's still on the younger side. I don't believe, maybe he's 25 years old. He is, as I look this up here, exactly 25 years old, just turned that a couple months ago. So when he heads into this offseason, obviously he's dealing with the knee injury right now, and there's really only so much you can do in terms of mid-season, let alone mid-post-season adjustments. But if he can get that knee healthy, maybe he works himself into a little bit better shape. There's been a lot of stories about him improving on his conditioning during this past offseason. If he can come out next year and sort of take his athleticism to the next level, I would love to see this fast-paced Mavericks team, especially with Kyrie Irving as his running mate, having the double bigs of Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively, who are both lob threats. I mean, you saw last night, if you watched the game, the lob that Kyrie threw to Daniel Gafford full court, basically looked off to the corner to draw the defender's attention out there. And then I wouldn't say it was quite a no look, but it was, it was just this little misdirection with his eyes that he ended up getting Gafford at the rim with a lob, and it was just a lot of fun to see, in my opinion. The Mavericks have been one of my favorite teams to watch the whole second half of the season, and last night was sort of the cultivation of all of these different aspects about this team coming together to provide a really fun version of basketball, and the Clippers just weren't able to keep up with it. So Clippers definitely may be in trouble here. TNT had a stat on the broadcast that just under 82% of winners of Game 5 when the series is tied 2-2 end up winning the series. They're now going to be headed back to Dallas. Their next game is on Friday night, so I feel like the Clippers are definitely up against the wall here as things currently stand on ESPN Bet. The Mavericks are 7.5-point favorites, so we'll see how this plays out. Kawhi Leonard was, of course, missing in this game as well. Doesn't seem to be 100%. I feel like he's probably doubtful to come back, but we'll have to see there. But let me know what your thoughts on this series are, and that is all we really have on this segment for now. We are going to be taking our first break of the show now. When we come back on the other side, we're going to be diving into the Celtics and Heat series that wrapped up last night. So stick with us, and we will be right back.